Hi, I'm Sarah Lopez with Preservation Inc. and this is video number 3 of 3 in what started out as a 2-video series and is now a 3-video series to provide you with an update on our progress on producing the 35% work plan for the alternative compliance pathway for Ag Order 4.0. Video number 1 was kind of an introduction to the requirements for this work plan, to the general A-R equation and nutrient management concepts in Ag Order 4.0. Video number 2 was a focus on some alternative compliance pathway ideas for alternative groundwater protection areas and a summary of the remaining tasks and decisions that Preservation Inc. has before we finalize the work plan. And then this video number 3 focuses on groundwater protection formulas in the alternative compliance pathway and a summary of our remaining tasks and decision points on those. So we're going to talk through root zone considerations for the groundwater protection formula, vadose zone considerations, and aquifer considerations. Diving into the root zone considerations, well, actually backing up one step, just in general, a comprehensive, aka complete groundwater protection formula should consider our whole system here. It should consider the root zone nitrogen cycle, the subroot zone nitrogen cycle, and aquifer nitrogen and water balances. Some of these things obviously are harder to put numbers to than others, but at least conceptually we want our framework to be comprehensive. So here's our A-R equation as it currently stands in the Ag Order applied to the root zone of our groundwater framework. And in Ag Order 4.0, the A-R equation really draws the box, so to speak, around the root zone. It's looking for the net of all the inputs and outputs to put a number to what may be leaving the bottom of the root zone and leaching down into the vadose zone. And then in Ag Order 4.0, as we talked about in the first video, the final target of 50 pounds of N per acre per year kind of expands that box or draws it at the bottom of the subroot zone and really looks for how do we make sure that this arrow of nitrogen leaching from the vadose zone and really hitting the top of the water table, how do we make sure that that water is no more than 10 parts per million of N? And so we went through actually the derivation from Ag Order 4.0 of how you jump from wanting this arrow to be no more than 10 parts per million and how that equates to 50 pounds of N per acre per year as the final limit. So for the alternative compliance pathway, I'd really like to ask the question, what if we get a little more comprehensive and draw our box around the entire system? And whether or not it's feasible to do that, explicitly in the formula, I don't know yet, but certainly our framework, I think, should really be reflecting nitrogen dynamics in the entire system, including the aquifer. So in Ag Order 4.0, currently, as I said before, it kind of draws the box at the bottom of the vadose zone, there, and it doesn't explicitly consider aquifer nitrogen or water balances. So the proposed formulas, groundwater protection formulas for the ACP will at least be based upon a framework that includes root zone, subroot zone, and aquifer considerations, i.e. the whole system. The proposed formula itself may or may not necessarily include specific terms for the subroot zone and aquifer. So there may end up being a difference between our conceptual framework and the actual formula that comes out of this process. We don't know yet. Some alternatives for the root zone piece of this formula that have already been discussed by our technical advisory committee and our stakeholder advisory committee were 4 different approaches. In number 1 here is the existing Ag Order 4.0 approach, net of A-R. We also talked about maybe doing net of A-R with some enhancements. So additional R terms, maybe denitrification in the root zone, which is not currently in the A-R equation. Number 3 here would be an enhanced A-R across different soil types and climates. So we know soil type and climate really influence growers' management practices and can really influence nitrogen and water dynamics. So in this case, we would be not only adding an additional R term or few, for example, root zone denitrification, but we'd also want to probably calculate a slightly different outcome for every soil, by climate, by crop combination that we have on the Central Coast. And then so that's number 3. And then in approach number 4, we're looking at some process model, for example, the SWOT, or Soil, Water, and Assessment tool that they use in the Central Valley. So here's our kind of concept framework of the root zone. Draw the box around the root zone, and let's look at what would our 4 different approaches look like if we actually spelled out the equation or formula for each one. Well, in approach number 1, we'd have the Ag Order 4.0 A-R equation, which includes all 5 of the 4.0 defined R values. In option 2, it would look almost identical. We would really just have this enhanced R where we would have additional approved and justified removal terms. So we've talked about ammonia volatilization, we've talked about root zone denitrification, we've talked about maybe treating mineralization, remineralization as a cycle as opposed to ACOMP, the C and O, I'm blanking on the term here, these guys, the mineralization factors. And then option 3 would also be very similar to the A-R equation. It's just that our enhanced R terms would vary by soil and climate and crop. So we could end up, as you might imagine, with quite a few of these. And then in option number 4, we would be taking really that same and applied data. So that's our AFER, our ACOMP, our AORG, our AER. We take those same numbers, and then we take our N remove values, same numbers, and our soil and climate and crop data, which would basically give us more real-world conditions than is currently maybe reflected in the A-R equation. And we put those, instead of putting them into an equation like what we have here, we'd be putting them into the SWOT model to calculate a value. So the outcomes of the TAC and SAC discussions on those root zone formulas, for option 1 here, just sticking with what's currently in the Ag Order, that A-R equation I think is really valued for its clarity and its simplicity. However, there were a lot of concerns that it's not comprehensive, so it doesn't accurately reflect the entirety of the root zone nitrogen cycle. I also want to note that our environmental policy and EJ stakeholders expressed a strong preference for this option. The Ag Order net of A-R with some enhancements was actually not preferred by anyone due to the lack of consideration for local soil and climate effects. And so that really left majority opinion sitting with option 3, or some kind of hybrid between option 3 and 4 here. I think that was probably closer to the majority opinion of our ag stakeholders, our technical stakeholders, so our researchers, our conservation practitioners, and extension stakeholders. And so there's also this recognition that as we increase the detail and the specificity of approach number 3 here, eventually that would result in us recreating the SWOT model, which already exists and is represented as approach number 4. So I think there's still some interest in exploring the SWAT models, which is valued for its comprehensiveness and its consideration of highly localized conditions. But there's some concerns over cost, how many and what kinds of assumptions are required to make it run, and then just the perceived complexity of the model versus simpler options that kind of convey a greater sense of transparency. So our decision points and remaining tasks for formula designation, at least in the root zone, we are going to maintain A and R reporting, which is required by Ag Order 4.0 for all growers. This A minus R equation, those calculations as per 4.0 can always be performed at the individual ranch scale for comparison with outcomes from an alternative approach. So this reporting and the ability to calculate A minus R is not going away. However, for the purposes of the alternative compliance program, the majority of our stakeholders wanted to steer away from approaches that do not account for localized soil and climate effects, and that do not account for the full root zone nitrogen cycle. So that kind of takes 1 and 2 off the table as the ACP alternative approaches. And that leaves us with the task to further develop options 3 and 4, or some hybrid of the two, within the next 6 weeks. And there is a lot of other information out there on approaches 3 and 4, certainly on the SWAT model. So I will find a way to add references or provide links to other presentations on approaches 3 and 4, some of which already exist. Okay, so that kind of concludes the root zone considerations. Now talking about the vadose zone. There are really 3 vadose zone or subroot zone alternatives. The Ag Order 4.0 approach is to apply a universal denitrification credit of 4.5 pounds, a recharge credit factor of 1.66 acre-feet. Another approach, an alternative, would be to apply denitrification and recharge data according to different soil types, climates, and more local hydrology, but maintaining a kind of an overall mass balance approach. So again, the vadose zone box, arrows in, arrows out. And then another approach would be NP-SAT. That's a non-point source assessment tool that they're using in the Central Valley, and it's being developed by Thomas Harder and coupled with hydrologic models. So here's our vadose zone concept. We've got nitrogen leaving the root zone, so it's a loss from the root zone, then it comes into the vadose zone, so it's an input to the vadose zone. We've got lateral inputs to the vadose zone from adjacent areas. We've got lateral losses and other losses from the vadose zone, so this includes denitrification. And then we've got recharge coming through the vadose zone and making its way to the aquifer. And then we've got ultimately the kind of the balance of nitrogen leaving the vadose zone as a loss term, entering the aquifer as an input term. The first thing I wanted to point out is that in all of our possible approaches, including the default Ag Order 4.0 as it currently stands, this number here, the nitrogen inputs from the root zone, this comes from the root zone formula. So whatever our approach is, we're going to be using the output of the root zone formula to put a number to this arrow here. We've got 3 different approaches to addressing recharge. In approach number 1, Ag Order 4.0 currently stands, we could apply 1.66 everywhere. We could use a different locally determined number based on the literature or something modeled. Or in approach number 3, we could use a number determined by modeled flow lines, and this is the NP-SAT approach. So it's basically you start from a below ground point somewhere, here in the water table, at the top of the water table, and it kind of back calculates flow lines going up to a contributing area on the land surface. For denitrification, in approach number 1, existing ag order, we would apply 4.5 pounds of N per acre per year everywhere. For approach number 2, we might apply a different locally determined number. That would be a literature value, most likely, or a collection of them. And then in approach number 3, we could use a model number, or currently the approach with MPSAT is to use a number that's derived from the literature, but then kind of tailored based on the application of these USGS dissolved oxygen maps. Or so they talk about kind of the reducing potential of the environment in different soil types, and so it's based on kind of a subsurface soil map, so you get that more localized. You get that kind of more localized consideration that way. Then for these arrows representing lateral inputs into and transport out of the vadose zone, one approach would be to not consider them. Another approach would be to use locally determined numbers with a default scenario where in equals out, so in minus out equals 0, where you could just set them both to 0 until you are ready to deal with them, but at least you would have them in your framework. And then if we were to take approach number 3 and use MPSAT, I think this would generally be accounted for by flow lines on paths from the surface to those below ground hypothetical sampling points. Okay, and then just to have a little bit more space here, the last error I wanted to deal with was nitrogen transport out of the vadose zone to the aquifer. So the ag order 4.0 approach would be to take root zone N, multiply it by 1.66 and add 4.5, and that equals the nitrogen transport to the aquifer everywhere. In another approach, we could make it a little more generic and say that it's going to be the sum of the approved inputs, which is kind of analogous to that root zone nitrogen net, then minus the sum of the approved outputs. In ag order 4.0, the only approved output is 4.5 for the vadose zone, and multiply that by approved recharge. So it'd be some number other than 1.66. And then that would equal nitrogen transport to the aquifer. Approach number 3, if we were to use MPSAT, what we'd be doing is kind of modeling the nitrogen concentration for every possible below ground sampling point based on these flow lines that relate back to, at the risk of making this super messy, a contributing land surface area that makes lots of possible flow line paths down to the hypothetical sampling point. Okay. So I think that with respect to tasks remaining ahead, to think about root zone aspects of the groundwater protection formula, option number 1 and its derivation are now pretty well understood, I think. We need to further develop this option number 2 and present it to the TAC and SAC for discussion probably in about 3 weeks. And we're preparing to present details to the TAC and SAC for discussion on NPSAT this week. So we do have one question for the water board, just planning work towards submittal of the 35% work plan. I'm wondering if we could submit the following, which would be sort of a mass balance approach in which we're asking for approval of this framework, this sum of approved inputs minus the sum of approved outputs times the approved recharge equals a nitrogen transport to the aquifer. So it's kind of the same framework that's currently used in ag order 4.0. And the values that we'd immediately submit for approval to kind of go in these slots would be So for this, we'd be submitting A-R. I'll just do that here. And then we'd be able to cite Ag Order 4.0 as our justification for that. This 4.5 would be our requested sum of the approved outputs, and then this 1.66 would be our requested approved value for recharge. And then if that was approved, in the 70% ACP, we would submit one or more additional values for approval. So it would still fit in this framework, but we'd be looking for approval of something other than these numbers to go in that framework. Okay, that does it for the root zone. Last item is aquifer considerations. So the aquifer or water-bearing zone is the receiving water body that needs to be protected or restored to or maintained at 10 milligrams per liter or less, with some additional provisions for non-degradation of cleaner aquifers. And aquifer levels are a product of nitrogen and water balances, and they are subject to input and loss terms just like the root zone and the vadose zone. So this is our full system. Let's draw our box around the whole system here. It includes the root zone, the vadose zone, and the aquifer. And these are all of our nitrogen input and loss arrows, and then some additional arrows showing recharge and extraction. And here I've just kind of expanded the aquifer box to so that we have a little bit larger of a canvas to work from. So in addition to the nitrogen coming out of the vadose zone and into the aquifer, we've got lateral nitrogen transport into the aquifer. I think there's a lateral transport out. There it is. It's behind my video box there. And then we've got our recharge coming into the aquifer, and we've got non-ag extraction taking water out, and we've got agricultural extraction taking water out. Along with the non-ag extraction, there's nitrogen in that water, and so that's a loss term. That's nitrogen leaving the aquifer. Same thing with the agricultural extraction. That's nitrogen leaving the aquifer. It's a loss term. And this loss term is actually quantified per requirements of Ag Order 4.0. This is the number A-EAR. It's reported by growers in their TNA reports and in the forthcoming INMP reports. So that loss error that I was just talking about, this irrigation water nitrogen leaves the aquifer, it's pumped up to the surface, and it's applied to the root zone. So if we take a scenario in which we're applying 50 pounds of irrigation water nitrogen, 150 pounds of fertilizer, and removing 125 pounds in our harvest, that's going to result in a calculation of 75 pounds of N leaching down from the root zone into the vadose zone. Let's just say, for the sake of simplicity, denitrification and recharge don't factor into anything. Let's say that 75 pounds goes straight down into the aquifer. So the way the A-R equation currently works, or the framework anyway, that's going to result in a situation that is non-compliant with the ag order, because it's going to calculate a net input of 75 pounds, and so that's above the final limit of 50. What's actually going on here, though, is that before this 50 pounds can be applied to the root zone, that 50 pounds is first removed from the aquifer. So we have our 50 pounds applied in irrigation water, our 150 pounds applied in fertilizer, 125 pounds harvested out, our net of 75 going down into the vadose zone, going down into the aquifer. So we're adding 75 pounds to the aquifer, but before we added that 75 pounds, we took 50 pounds out, so the net change in the aquifer is 25 pounds of N. And this seems like a fairly obvious thing. It's not as explicitly clear in the framework that underpins the A-R equations in the ag order as they stand currently. But I think it's pretty clear pumping or extraction from high nitrogen aquifers for irrigation is a numerically significant nitrogen removal term. It is a loss pathway, plain and simple. Growers are going to need as many tools, aka arrows, in their toolbox as possible to reduce their impact to groundwater. And so we want to make sure that the conceptual framework for the ACP successfully incentivizes more nitrogen removal from high nitrogen aquifers, not less. And it's not clear to me that the A-R equation as it currently stands is doing that. And the reason I say that is because of growers who have basically told me that they are stopping the use of their high nitrogen wells, and they're going to go dig the deepest, cleanest, lowest nitrogen well they can so that they're not penalized for the nitrogen in their irrigation water by the A-R equation. And I know that's not the thought process we want them to have, but that is the thought process that the A-R equation as it's currently written evokes, and that's a problem. When we fail to include this removal term in our nitrogen accounting, we may be failing to incentivize the fullest use of this pathway, and that would be leaving an important tool out of the management toolbox. So that's the end, and I apologize for ending on a cliffhanger here. I don't know what to do about that. This is not sort of a blatant seeking of additional nitrogen credits for the growers. It's a legitimate concern that has been expressed by growers, and I share it as well, that the way the A-R equation, rather than incentivizing the use of nitrogen in irrigation water, it's sort of viewed as more of a penalty for having nitrogen in your irrigation water, which leads growers to seek ways to have lower nitrogen irrigation water, which is the exact opposite of what you would want to do in an aquifer management scenario. So I think this is something we need to tackle in the alternative compliance pathway. I don't know what the answer is yet. But I guess that's our next task to think about. Thank you.